was with child. No one asked how. No one asked who. They only cast her out, dragged her into the wilderness like a burden too heavy to carry. The man they left her with was not what anyone expected. He didn't speak much, only pointed to the cabin door, then turned back toward the shed as if she were no different from the sack of flour they had left beside her. Elena stood trembling, her wrists red from rope burns where they had bound her, her eyes swollen from tears shed in silence. No blessing, no prayer had been given for her. Only exile. If you love Wild West stories, make sure to subscribe so I can share one with you every day. And don't forget to leave a like and drop the number 1 in the comments so I'll know you're ready for this story. She was barely 20, her vows broken in the eyes of the church, barefoot in snow belly just beginning to swell, and now abandoned in the middle of nowhere with a man twice her size who hadn't said a word. The cabin door creaked open. Warmth met her face. Firelight danced across the rough wooden floor. A cot in one corner, a table with a basin hooks hung with furs, a shotgun above the mantel. When she turned, he was gone. Elena stepped in slowly, the door shutting behind her, by the wind's hand, not his. She sank to her knees by the fire, clutching her middle, as though she could shield the fragile life within. No one had asked her story. No one wanted it. Only judgment, only shame. Days passed in silence. The man Rourke, he called himself, thus left before dawn and returned after dusk, always with meat or wood. He never touched her, never questioned her, barely even looked her way. Elena cleaned because she knew nothing else to do, cooked what she could, though her hands shook from inexperience. On the 5th morning, she woke to blood. Panic seized her. She cried out, "Please, Lord, not the child." Rourke came crashing in, axe in hand, snow on his shoulders. He looked once, then, without asking, lifted her into his arms and laid her on the cot. Hours passed. The bleeding slowed. She did not lose it. And though he said nothing, she saw his hands tremble as he covered her with furs. "You cared," she whispered. "Don't flatter yourself," he muttered, though his voice cracked when he said it. The storm came soon after, howling down from the mountains, trapping them inside for 5 days. They spoke little, only what was necessary. Yet when she slipped on the ice and flinched at his touch, he stopped cold. "I'm not your father," he said quietly. She stared astonished. No man had ever spoken such words to her. By the 2nd month, her belly swelled steady, and though silence still ruled between them, she began to notice the signs. A second bowl placed its supper boots stitched without her asking, a blanket folded near the fire. He was not cruel, he was not kind. He was something in between, something unreadable. And though she had been cast out as unworthy, as stained here in the frozen silence of the wilderness, Sister Elena began to wonder if perhaps God had not abandoned her after all. Exile does not always begin with chains. Sometimes it begins with silence. For Agnes, the mountain was silence made flesh. The cabin stood apart from the world, buried in drifts of snow where the wind moaned through the pines like a choir of ghosts. Days bled into nights without bells to mark the hours, no hymns to steady her heart. Only the creak of timbers in the storm, only her own breath quickening when the child within her stirred. Rourke spoke little, and when he did, his words were no more than a gesture of necessity would. Water, eat. The rest was left to the heavy air between them. At first, Agnes feared him more than the loneliness. His silence felt like judgment, his scarred face like a wall she could not climb. But she soon learned that his silence wasn't cruelty. It was armor built long before she ever crossed his threshold. The first weeks were a trial of the body. Agnes had known discipline in the convent, the fasts, the long prayers, but this was different. Here, survival was a liturgy of labor. Each morning she rose to fetch water from the half-frozen stream, her breath a cloud in the dawn. She chopped roots with trembling hands, struggled to lift logs heavier than her frame, and stitched what few garments she owned until her fingers bled. The baby weighed her down slow and relentless, reminding her with each kick that she could not flee her condition. And yet, Rourke noticed, she would find an extra log placed by the hearth before she woke. A pair of boots, patched clumsily but sturdier than before, left by the door. Once, after a day of gathering sticks in the snow, she returned to find her torn gloves neatly mended with coarse thread. She looked to him, expecting acknowledgement, but he only turned his face toward the fire, as if ashamed to be caught in kindness. Agnes, raised on Scripture, began to wonder if the Lord was testing her, not with abandonment, but with a companion she did not understand. Then came the storm. It roared down from the peaks one night like the wrath of an angry God. The cabin groaned under its weight. Snow clawed at the shutters. Icy air seeped through the chinks in the logs. Agnes felt the first cramp in her belly as she knelt to stir the stew. Sharp, sudden, merciless. She dropped the spoon and clutched herself, fear crashing over her. The child, her secret curse, and her secret hope, threatened to be torn from her. She staggered to the bed, pain seizing her, a fever breaking across her skin. The memories of that night in the churchyard returned like daggers, his hands, his laughter, the silence of those who turned away. Now to lose the child would be to suffer twice. First in the taking, and then in the stripping away of what little purpose remained. Through her haze, she felt a hand calloused, rough, and startlingly gentle press a damp cloth against her brow. Rook. He moved with awkward care, fetching water, propping her up against his chest so she could breathe. His arms, scarred and massive, formed a cradle, steadier than any pew. Agnes drifted in and out of fever. In her delirium, she thought she heard him murmur something, not words exactly, but a low hum, like a soldier's tune, carried from another life. She clung to it as if it were prayer. By dawn, the fever broke. She woke weak, her body spent, but the child within her still stirred. And there at the bedside sat Rook. He had not slept. His eyes, shadowed and weary, were fixed on the fire, but his presence was steady, immovable, like the mountain itself. For the first time since her father abandoned her, Agnes felt something stir within her chest that was not despair. It was small, fragile, almost foolish, but it was trust. If this moment touched your heart, give this story a like and drop the number 1 in the comments, so I know you're with me. Trust is a fragile seed, and yet in winter, even fragile seeds can take root. After the night of fever and fear, Agnes awoke to a strange new certainty she was no longer utterly alone. The child within her still lived, and beside her sat a man who had not abandoned her, though he had every reason to. Yet survival is a jealous master. It does not grant peace for long. Her body remained weak. The sickness clung to her like a shroud, her breath shallow, her skin pale and damp. Rook watched her closely. When she tried to rise and tend to the fire, her legs gave way. He caught her before she struck the floor. For the first time, she met his eyes long enough to see not just the scars that marred his face, but the unspoken worry hidden behind them. That night, as she lay shivering, the truth settled on him like the weight of the mountain itself. The herbs and thin broth he could offer would not be enough. She needed medicine beyond what his solitude could provide. To stay was to risk losing her and the child. So before dawn, Rook pulled on his worn coat and heavy boots. Agnes stirred at the sound, her voice a rasp. Where are you going?" His answer was as short as it was final. "Down." She reached for him, fear clutching her heart. "You'll die in that storm." He looked at her, his silence heavy. The wind turned to the door. A blizzard howled as if to prove her right, swallowing him whole when he stepped into the white void. The journey down the mountain was not a march, but a battle. Snow rose past his knees, then his thighs dragging at him, like hands determined to pull him under. The wind lashed against his face, tearing the breath from his lungs. He wrapped a scarf around his mouth, but the cold gnawed through wool and leather alike. Each step forward was an act of will. Memories haunted him as he stumbled onward. A battlefield long ago, mud smoke, and the cries of men. He had carried comrades heavier than logs, bleeding in his arms, only to bury them in shallow graves. Silence had become his refuge, then his only way to endure the ghosts. Now silence was broken by the single thought that drove him. She must not die as they did. Not her, not the child. Hours blurred into a cruel eternity. At last, through the storm's veil, a cluster of lantern lights appeared, the distant outline of a village clinging to the valley floor. Rook staggered into its streets, half frozen, his face raw with frostbite. The people recoiled at first sight of him, a scarred giant bursting from the storm. But his words, broken and harsh, carried desperation medicine. For her. Coins he had hoarded for years changed hands. A small bundle of herbs, powders, and tinctures was pressed into his palm. Without waiting, he turned back into the storm. The climb back nearly killed him. The wind clawed at his chest, his limbs screamed for rest. Once he collapsed into the snow darkness, creeping into the edges of his sight. In that stillness, he thought of the fragile woman in his cabin, her hand clutching her belly, her lips whispering prayers no one else would hear. He forced himself up again. When at last the cabin came into view, it felt less like wood and stone and more like sanctuary. He stumbled inside the door, slamming against the wind. Agnes gasped at the sight of him, his beard caked with ice skin, blistered by the cold eyes, hollowed by exhaustion. But in his hands, he held the medicine. He dropped it onto the table, collapsed to his knees, and for the first time, let himself breathe. Agnes, weak as she was, crawled toward him and touched his frozen hand. "Why would you risk your life for me?" For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, his voice low and rough, he answered with words that cut deeper than any sermon, "I'm not your father." It was a vow spoken in a single sentence. He would not abandon her, no matter the cost. "Stay with me, because from here, the story turns in ways you won't expect." Vows are not always spoken in chapels. Sometimes they are carried in silence, in a man's refusal to turn away. After Rook's perilous journey, the cabin became something more than shelter. For Agnes, it was a fragile sanctuary, warmed not only by the fire, but by the knowledge that someone had chosen to fight for her. Her health steadied, the child within her pressed more boldly against her ribs, and for the first time since her exile, she dared to dream of a tomorrow. It was in that fragile spring, when the snow melted into rivulets down the mountain, that the past found her once again. One morning, as Agnes knelt in the damp earth, coaxing green shoots from a patch of soil near the cabin, a voice called her name. Not Rook's deep silence, not the wind, but something higher, younger, quivering with disbelief. Agnes. She turned and her heart nearly broke. There at the edge of the clearing stood Seth, her little brother, his coat too large for his slight frame, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. He could not have been more than 13, but he looked older, for the worry etched into his brow. "Seth," she whispered. And before she could rise, he was running, arms flung around her. She held him tightly, forgetting the dirt on her hands, the swell of her belly pressing between them. For the first time in months, she felt the embrace of family. But when Seth pulled back, his eyes fell to her stomach. His lips parted in shock. She braced herself for the condemnation she had come to expect. Yet no judgment came. Instead, his small hands pressed gently against her side, and he whispered, "Sister, you're going to have a baby?" Tears stung her eyes. "Yes, little one." He looked up at her, not with scorn, but with a fierce, protective light. "Then I'll help you." Agnes wept openly, her hands trembling as they cupped his face. In that moment, the mountain did not feel like exile. It felt like a place where love could still take root. Over the next days, Seth filled the cabin with chatter. He spoke of their mother, how grief had hollowed her, how sickness now kept her in bed. Agnes listened, her heart torn between joy at seeing her brother and sorrow for the woman who had once been her shield. Agnes felt the old fear claw at her chest, but another feeling rose. With it, resolve. She had been silenced once. She would not be silenced forever. That night, as Seth slept near the hearth, Agnes sat beside Rook. The firelight caught the hollows of his scarred face, softened them into something almost tender. She spoke in a whisper, though Seth's snores filled the room. "I cannot stay hidden forever. My mother is dying. And if I remain silent, that man's sins will go unpunished. My child, my brother, they deserve a world where truth is spoken." Rook did not answer at once. His silence stretched deep as the forest outside. Finally, he walked to a small workbench and returned with something he had been carving, the frame of a wooden cradle, unfinished but sturdy, its edges smoothed by his hand. He set it down before her. "For when the time comes," he said simply. Agnes touched the wood, her throat tight. It was not just a cradle. It was a promise, a belief in a future she had almost surrendered. When at last she looked up, Rook placed a knife in her hand. Its handle was worn, the blade honed sharp. "When you go back," he said, his voice low and steady, "you'll need this." It was not command. It was trust. For the first time, Agnes felt she was no longer a burden carried against his will. She was a partner in a fight neither of them had chosen, yet both were bound to. And with Seth's small frame curled beneath the blankets, she knew the time to hide was over. The time to face the world had come. Do you believe justice will be done? Leave a comment with your guess before we reach the ending. Some journeys are not made by choice. They are made because silence can no longer protect the living. Agnes had hidden long enough. With Seth at her side and Rook behind them like a silent shadow, she returned down the mountain. The snow had thinned, the roads were wet with thaw, but each step carried the weight of years. She was no longer the cloistered sister who had whispered prayers in dim chapels. She was a woman marked by exile, carrying both child and truth in her body. The town stared when she appeared. The swell of her belly beneath her cloak drew gasps. Mothers clutched their children closer. Men turned away uneasily. Whispers darted like knives fallen none. Disgrace. Yet her gaze did not falter. She walked into the heart of her shame with Seth clutching her hand. At her family's house, she found her mother wasted to a shadow, lying upon a narrow bed. The old woman's breath was shallow, her hands thin as bird bones. When she saw Agnes, her eyes filled with tears, not of judgment, but of longing. "My child," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They told me you were gone." Agnes knelt beside her, holding her mother's frail hand against her cheek. "I was cast away," she said softly, "but not lost. I am here now." The minister's son did not wait long. Word of her return had spread like wildfire, and scandal to him was more dangerous than any bullet. He and his father gathered men, desperate souls bought with money and liquor, and sent them to finish what Exile had not. They came to the mountain cabin in the dead of night. Torches flickered between the trees, boots crunched in the snow. Inside, Seth's eyes widened in terror, but Agnes laid a hand on his shoulder. "We will not run again," she whispered. Rook was already moving, his massive frame steady as a stone wall. He handed her the knife he had given once before. She gripped it tightly, her hand trembling but unbroken. The clash was sudden and fierce. The door burst open, shadows poured in, and the cabin filled with smoke and firelight. Rook fought with brutal economy, each swing of his fists and blade. Felling a man, Agnes, though heavy with child, struck once to drive back an attacker, her cry more of defiance than strength. Seth, small but swift, darted to the corner where a pistol lay hidden and fired a single shot that sent the intruders scattering back toward the tree line. Agnes, breath-ragged hair clinging to her damp forehead, stepped forward. She lifted her chin, though every muscle trembled. "Here is your witness," she said to the sheriff. "Here is your truth." And no man dared silence her again. Weeks passed. Justice ran its course, slow, imperfect, but enough. The minister's son was jailed. The father's influence shattered. The whispers in town turned from judgment to awe. Back on the mountain, peace settled over the cabin. The baby was born in the hush of spring, his cries breaking through the stillness like the first bell of Easter morning. Rook stood over the cradle he had carved the names of, four-etched into its wood, Agnes, Rook, Seth. Child. Agnes no longer wore the habit, but she did not abandon her faith. It lived now not in stone walls or sermons, but in the warmth of Rook's hand, steadying hers in Seth's laughter echoing through the pines, in the child sleeping safe under their roof. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the peaks, Rook placed something in her palm, a ring carved from dark walnut smooth beneath her fingers. Not a jewel, not a priest's blessing, just a promise. He did not speak, but he did not need to. For they had already spoken the truest vow, not to leave, not to abandon, not to let silence rule where love and courage had been born. And in that vow, Agnes found the only faith she would ever need. If you love Western tales of faith and redemption like this one, subscribe and move on to the next story waiting for you.